You have often believed that revenge belongs to the noisy, to the storm, to the loud words and the final accusations. You have imagined that only the ones who slam the door, who speak their rage into the air, who expose their wounds with fire, can wound back. But I tell you, there is a form of revenge far more devastating, more shattering than any eruption of anger, the quiet exit of the empath. It is not the noise of confrontation that breaks the soul, but the silence that follows when the one who always gave, always carried, always absorbed, has finally decided to leave without a trace. This silence is the most unbearable punishment, for it reflects the mirror of absence, and absence is the abyss no one dares to face. You see, the empath is the vessel of archetypal sacrifice. They embody the Christ figure in the family, the healer in relationships, the scapegoat who takes upon themselves the poison of others. They draw the shadows out of people and, in their own suffering, carry them like a chalice. But what is not understood is that such a soul, who lives in the undercurrents of feeling, has access to a force far more dangerous than anger. Withdrawal, when they finally step back, when their heart that once beat for others folds into its own rhythm, it leaves a vacuum so deep that the other, the abuser, the manipulator, must face their own barren echo. The brutal quality of this revenge is that it is not aimed, not shouted, not declared. It is simply lived. The empath does not craft their silence as a weapon, yet silence becomes the sharpest sword. In the mythic sense, it is the same force as the goddess who descends into the underworld and refuses to return until the world above acknowledges what it has lost. The empath's quiet exit exposes the truth, not by accusation, but by absence. And truth revealed through absence burns longer than the truth spoken through rage. Do you understand? It is the archetype of the mother withdrawing her breast from the infant who never knew. It was not eternal. It is the lover who once forgave endlessly, whose warmth became expected, and who one morning does not open the door. It is the friend who absorbed years of betrayal with gentle eyes, and who suddenly, without words, is no longer there. This absence is the mirror of shadow. The one left behind must face what they were, what they did, and who they truly are. Without the empath's endless giving, that confrontation is hell itself, because it is the confrontation with the rejected shadow. I recall many dreams in which a patient would tell me they found themselves in an empty house. At first, they wandered searching, calling for someone. Then, when they realized no one would come, panic arose. Why? Because the empty house is the symbol of abandonment, of the inner void that one cannot fill with distraction or noise. It is the echo of the empath's absence. For as long as the empath was present, even when neglected or abused, their light provided a sense of fullness. When the empath leaves quietly, that fullness collapses, and all that remains is the skeleton of the house, the psyche stripped of its illusion of care. And this is why the quiet exit is brutal, because it forces the soul to see its own nakedness. Rage may be dismissed, attacked, or defended against. Silence cannot. Silence grows. It spreads like fog into every corner of the mind. It whispers questions that cannot be silenced. Why did they leave without a word? What did I do that was so unbearable they preferred absence to explanation? The silence is a mirror in which one sees not the other, but oneself. That is why it cuts more deeply than any sort of words. The empath's journey to this exit is long. It does not happen suddenly. It is like a river carving stone, slow, hidden, inevitable. For years, the empath tolerates, absorbs, excuses, forgives. They believe in the transformation of the other. They live with the archetype of the wounded healer, carrying the projection of Savior. But eventually, even rivers dry when the sun of abuse beats down without mercy. The empath realizes that no transformation is possible while they remain, and so quietly, without grand announcement, they retreat. It is not cruelty, it is survival, but survival itself becomes cruelty in the eyes of those who depended on their sacrifice. Imagine the archetype of Orpheus. He sings to the underworld, softening even the heart of Hades. But when he turns and Eurydice disappears forever, the silence that follows is more devastating than any scream. The Empress Orpheus turned inward. Their departure is not thunder. It is the sudden stillness after the last note, the unbearable awareness that the song has ended. I tell you, many people fear confrontation, but the true fear is abandonment. To be abandoned by the one who embodied compassion is to be exposed to the raw desert of the self. This is why those who lose an empath through quiet exit often chase, beg, accuse, project. They do not seek the person. They seek the restoration of the illusion that someone will endlessly hold their chaos. But the empath has crossed the threshold. Once they have tasted freedom, there is no return. The brutality lies not in punishment, but in revelation. Revelation is always brutal when the unconscious is exposed, when the mask of persona falls, when the soul realizes it is alone with its own shadow. The experience is shattering. The empath's quiet exit functions as such a revelation. It is not revenge in the human sense, it is archetypal revenge. It is life itself balancing the scales through absence. Do you see the paradox? The empath does not desire revenge, yet their very act of leaving becomes the most devastating revenge possible. This is why it appears brutal. It is not because they sought to hurt, but because they ceased to shield. They stopped carrying the other's shadow. And when that shadow returns to its rightful owner, the weight is unbearable. It is important to reflect on the symbolic meaning of the quiet exit. In dreams, silence is not emptiness, it is the fullness of the unconscious. The empath becomes silence, becomes the figure that withdraws into the collective unconscious, leaving the conscious ego to struggle. In myth, such figures are often gods who depart when not honored. The harvest fails, the rivers dry, the land withers. So too does the inner world of the one who lost their empath. It becomes barren, for the divine source has withdrawn. And what of the empath? They step into a new archetype, the wanderer, the one who seeks their own soul beyond the projections of others. Their quiet exit is not only an ending, it is a beginning. They reclaim the energy once spent in tending others' wounds. They hear, for the first time, the voice of their own unconscious calling. They discover that the silence they left behind for others becomes the music that guides them into individuation. In this sense, the brutal revenge is also sacred liberation. Let me tell you a story of a woman who came to me long ago in Zurich. She had spent her youth with a man who drank, who wounded, who betrayed. For years she stayed, saying, "If I love him enough, he will change." She became hollow, her face pale, her body sick with the weight of his shadow. Then, one day, she said nothing. She packed no rage, wrote no letter. She simply left. Years later, the man found himself in despair, telling anyone who would listen that the silence of her departure was the cruelest thing he had ever endured. He could fight words, but he could not fight the void she left. And she found herself in analysis for the first time, learning what it means to carry her own life. Her quiet exit was both his punishment and her salvation. This, my friends, is the mystery of archetypal balance. The psyche always seeks equilibrium. When the empath withdraws, the energy once held in imbalance returns to its source. The other experiences collapse. The empath experiences rebirth. And though the world calls it revenge, I call it individuation. When the empath leaves, the psyche of the abandoned one begins to tremble. At first, they may laugh, dismiss, or pretend indifference, yet in the quiet hours, when the unconscious stirs, the silence spreads like roots into their dreams. They dream of doors closing, of trains leaving the station, of wandering through streets where familiar faces no longer recognize them. The unconscious speaks in images. The empath has become the absent figure, the vanished guide, the missing warmth. This is the dream's brutal honesty. It tells the ego what the ego refuses to admit. I have listened to many who told me they did not care when the gentle one left them. And then, weeks later, their dreams betrayed them. They dreamt of a garden turned to desert, of food turning to ash, of a voice calling their name, and yet no body to be found. These dreams are not punishments. They are mirrors. The psyche reveals to them what they destroyed when they consumed without giving, when they demanded without honoring. And these dreams, like the empath's silence, cannot be fought. They cannot be silenced by logic. They work from within, dissolving the illusions of self-sufficiency. You may think that revenge is cruel, but in truth, the empath's quiet exit is only cruel in proportion to the denial of the other. If the other refuses to see their shadow, the silence is a wound. If they accept the silence as a mirror, the silence becomes initiation. Many abusers, manipulators, or narcissistic souls never accept this. They rage against the silence, seeking to drag the empath back into the familiar dance. But the empath who has walked into the night does not return, for the silence has become their own teacher. And what of the empath during this exile? Their silence is not empty. It is filled with the voices of their own soul that were drowned for years by the cries of others. For the first time, they hear the ancient whisper that says, "You too are worthy of being seen. You too deserve the embrace you once gave to all." The archetype of the healer transforms into the archetype of the wanderer, and from wanderer into the wise one. This path cannot be walked until the empath leaves behind the cage of others' projections There is a myth that illustrates this well. Demeter, the goddess of the harvest, lost her daughter Persephone to the underworld. In her grief, she withdrew her gifts from the earth. Crops withered, rivers shrank, famine spread. Only when her absence was recognized did the gods tremble and negotiate her daughter's return. Demeter's withdrawal was not petty vengeance, it was the revelation of her power. So too is the empath's quiet exit a revelation. It says, "You believed my giving was endless, but you did not honor its source. Now see the world without it. I tell you, this is why the empath's departure is the most brutal form of revenge, because it is not personal, it is archetypal. It is not the small drama of lovers or friends or families. It is the archetype of the divine withdrawing from those who profaned its gift, and archetypes are merciless teachers. They do not negotiate, they do not argue. They reveal. The empaths may at first feel guilt, for their nature is to give, to repair, to heal. But as they walk deeper into silence, they realize that guilt was another chain. They discover that to withdraw is to honor their own soul. In analysis, I have often told patients, the shadow of love is exploitation. Where there is love without boundaries, exploitation follows. The empath who finally exits learns this truth, not in theory, but in blood. And when they leave quietly, they shed the false guilt imposed upon them by those who fed on their light. Now let us look deeper into the psychic structure of this dynamic. The empath carries a strong anima or animus complex, a highly developed capacity for feeling nurtured, often in childhood, where they learn survival through sensitivity. They sense the unspoken, they carry the moods of others, they sacrifice to preserve connection. In psychological terms, they are caught in the mother archetype, not as mother to themselves, but as eternal mother to others. They nurture without end, yet the unconscious demands balance. Every archetype becomes destructive when lived one-sidedly. The mother archetype without withdrawal becomes devouring. The empath devours themselves to feed others. The quiet exit is the moment when this archetype breaks. It is when the unconscious demands individuation. The empath withdraws not to destroy others, but to stop destroying themselves. Yet, to those who depended on their sacrifice, this withdrawal feels like death. They project onto the empath cruelty, betrayal, revenge, but in truth, the empath has simply ceased to participate in their projection. This is the brutality, the end of illusion. In the seminar halls of my time, I would often say, the most terrifying experience is to meet the self. The self is not what the ego wishes it to be. It is vast, impersonal, filled with both light and shadow. When the empath exits, they embody the self-withdrawing. The one left behind is forced to meet their own self in the mirror of silence. And this is why they suffer. For most people do not wish to meet the self. They wish to remain in the comfort of projections. The empath's absence destroys this comfort. I remember a man who once told me, when she left without a word, it was like God abandoned me. He did not realize his words carried archetypal truth. The empath had been his God image, the vessel of his salvation. When she withdrew, He faced his own inner wasteland. He could no longer avoid his emptiness by leaning on her endless supply of compassion. That emptiness became his trial, his punishment, and potentially his salvation. But whether he transformed depended not on her return, but on his willingness to face the shadow. And this brings me to the final point of this wave. The quiet exit of the empath is brutal, not because it is cruel, but because it is just. Justice, in the archetypal sense, is balance. Too much energy has been taken, too much shadow projected. The psyche restores equilibrium through absence. In myth, the gods punish hubris by withdrawal. In dreams, the anima punishes neglect by turning cold. In life, the empath punishes exploitation by leaving silently. This is not human justice, it is cosmic justice. The silence left behind by the empath is like a temple after the god has departed. The walls remain, the rituals are remembered, but the spirit that animated them is gone. This absence exposes a truth that few dare to confront. The god was never the temple, it was the living breath within it. In the same way, the empath was not merely a role, not merely a body in the room. They were the soul that animated the relationship, the unseen current that held together what would otherwise collapse. When that current withdraws, the collapse is inevitable. And collapse, though brutal, is also revelation. You may notice that those who lose an empath often try to replace them quickly. They grasp for another source of energy, another vessel to pour their shadows into, but what they find is only a reflection, not the original. For the empath's gift cannot be replicated at will. It is born of a unique constellation of wounds and love, of archetypal inheritance and personal history. It is a flame lit in darkness. When that flame leaves, no imitation can replace it. The loss becomes a haunting, for the unconscious knows that something sacred has been lost. This haunting reveals itself in small moments. The abandoned one hears a song that once played in the background of their life with the empath. It stings, not because of nostalgia, but because of the silence behind it. They pass a place once shared and feel emptiness instead of warmth. They encounter kindness in another, but it feels shallow, because the empath's compassion was not surface, it was depth. Such moments become daggers, not because the empath intends harm, but because the psyche cannot tolerate the void. This is the brutality of the quiet exit, the recognition that what was taken for granted was, in truth, irreplaceable. For the empath, this departure is not a single act, but a long initiation. They must wrestle with the guilt of abandoning what they once believed was their purpose. They must encounter the part of themselves that equated love with sacrifice, compassion with self-destruction. They must enter their own underworld and meet the shadow they denied, the shadow that longs to be free, to be loved without condition, to exist without the burden of others' chaos. This is not an easy passage. It is filled with dreams of drowning, of being chased, of standing at thresholds. Yet each dream, each symbol reveals that they are moving toward individuation. Individuation, you must remember, is never comfortable. It is always the path of tearing away illusions, of breaking the shells that once held us. The empath shell is their role as caretaker. When that shell cracks, they fear annihilation. But what emerges is not death. It is the self. The self demands wholeness, not half-living. And the self cannot be born while the ego is enslaved to the endless demands of others. Thus, the empath's quiet exit is not only a revelation to the other, it is a birth for themselves. Dreams often reveal this birth. I have seen empaths who, after leaving, dream of walking through vast forests, of discovering hidden rivers, of finding rooms within houses they never knew existed. These dreams are the language of the self. They say, now you can explore what was hidden. Now you can live your own myth. The brutality of the exit for others is mirrored by the liberation for the empath. The same act that devastates one soul awakens another. This paradox is the heart of archetypal truth. Consider also the symbolic meaning of revenge. In the human sense, revenge is an act of retaliation, meant to restore dignity or balance through suffering. But in the archetypal sense, revenge is the unconscious restoring equilibrium through symbol and event. The empath does not choose revenge, but revenge chooses them. Their withdrawal becomes the unconscious response to years of imbalance. This is why it feels fated, inevitable, as though destiny itself intervened. The empath becomes an agent of archetypal justice, and what of those left behind? Some remain trapped in bitterness, unable to see beyond their own wound. Others, however, are forced into their own individuation. For the silence of the empath can awaken even the most resistant soul. In their absence, the abandoned one may confront the truth of their own shadow, realizing the parasitism that consumed their relationships. Some begin analysis, seeking to understand why the departure was so unbearable. In such cases, the empath's exit becomes a catalyst for transformation. Their absence, though brutal, becomes sacred. We must understand this not as personal drama, but as the eternal dance of archetypes. The empath embodies the archetype of sacrifice until the unconscious demands balance. The withdrawal awakens the archetype of abandonment in the other, forcing confrontation with the shadow. The pain is immense because archetypes are immense. They are larger than life, older than culture, eternal patterns of the human psyche. To live them unconsciously is to suffer. To recognize them is to transform. This is why I say the empath's quiet exit is the most brutal revenge, because it is not merely between two individuals, it is between archetypes. It is the collision of the mother and the orphan, the healer and the wounded, the savior and the betrayed. When the empath leaves, the archetypal balance shifts violently, and no human ego can resist such forces without trembling. The empaths themselves must also beware, for silence can harden into bitterness if not guided by consciousness. To leave quietly is to reclaim power, but to remain closed is to imprison oneself. The danger is that the empath, once liberated, becomes fearful of connection, associating all intimacy with exploitation. They may withdraw not only from the abuser but from life itself. This is not individuation but avoidance. To individuate. The empath must learn to give without self-destruction. to love with boundaries, to embrace their own shadow of selfishness and need, only then does the silence of their exit transform from revenge into wisdom. In the myths, silence is often the prelude to revelation. Prophets withdraw into caves, shamans into forests, Edois into exile. Their silence is not mere absence, it is gestation. The empath who leaves is entering their cave, their forest, their exile, and from this silence, a new voice will one day emerge. It will not be the voice of endless sacrifice, but the voice of wholeness, and when they speak again, it will not be to save others, but to reveal truth. That truth will heal more than their silence ever hurt. But first, silence must do its work. So we return to the beginning, the quiet exit as brutal revenge. It is brutal because it reveals what words conceal. It is revenge because it restores balance without effort. It is archetypal because it enacts patterns older than humanity itself. And yet, within this brutality lies liberation for both the empath and the one left behind. One is freed to find themselves, the other is forced to confront themselves. And that is the essence of psychic truth. The soul will always push us toward wholeness, even if the path is paved with silence and absence. There is a peculiar irony in human relationships. The more one clings, the more one hastens loss. The empath's quiet exit often comes at the very moment when the other believes possession is secure. They confuse presence with permanence, forgetting that the soul is not a possession, but a living current. When that current withdraws, it is as if the gods themselves have turned their gaze elsewhere. And so the one left behind is confronted not only with loneliness, but with the revelation of their own hubris. They thought they could consume light endlessly without giving light in return. Yet all light demands reciprocity. You see, the empath's silence is not merely absence, it is a mirror of cosmic law. Every archetype moves in cycles. The sun rises and sets, the tides flow and withdraw. The breath inhales and exhales. To believe that one may receive without end, without offering balance, is to deny the fundamental rhythm of the psyche. The empath's exit restores rhythm, and rhythm, when it returns suddenly after long distortion, feels like violence. But violence is often the mask of truth. Many who lose an empath attempt to rewrite the story. They invent narratives. She was selfish, he was weak. They could not endure real love. These narratives are defenses against the unbearable silence. Yet, when night falls, when the unconscious opens its gates, the narratives falter, dreams whisper otherwise. In the dream, they see the empath as a figure clothed in light, walking away into the horizon. They cry out, but their voice makes no sound. They chase, but their legs are heavy. They awaken with a taste of abandonment, and ego scrambles to dismiss it. But the unconscious has spoken, and the unconscious is relentless. Now, what of the empaths in their new silence? They too are haunted, but by different ghosts. For years, they equated love with endurance, identity with sacrifice. When they step away, they encounter a frightening emptiness. Who am I? when I am not the healer? Who am I when I am not needed? This is the threshold of individuation. It is a point where the mask is removed, where the archetype is no longer lived blindly but is integrated consciously. The empaths must face their shadow, their hidden desire to be cared for, their suppressed rage at being used, their longing for a love that is mutual. In this confrontation, many empaths tremble. They dream of dark waters, of storms, of standing before vast mountains. These are not punishments, but invitations. The unconscious is saying, your soul is larger than your role. You are not only healer, you are also creator, wanderer, lover, Souverein. Your identity is not bound to suffering. To realize this is to step into the self, and the self, once glimpsed, transforms everything. The brutality of the empath's exit then is twofold. It devastates those left behind, and it shatters the empath's own illusions. Yet, out of devastation arises rebirth. For those abandoned, the silence may awaken the shadow and force the first steps toward wholeness. For the empath, the silence becomes the womb of their own transformation. Both are brutal, both are sacred, both belong to the eternal rhythm of the psyche. Do not imagine that silence is passive. Silence is active in the deepest sense. It is the action of the self, which works not through noise but through inevitability. The empath's quiet exit is a message written not in words but in archetypal force. It says, the time of imbalance is over. The illusion of endless sacrifice is ended. The shadow will return to its owner, and the healer will return to their own soul. This is why the exit feels like fate, as though woven by unseen hands, and in truth, it is, think of the alchemical process. The vessel must be sealed, the substance must be withdrawn from the outer world, placed in the heat of transformation. Only in this sealed silence can transmutation occur. The empath's silence is alchemical. They withdraw their essence from the chaos of others and place it into the vessel of their own soul. They are under the fire of solitude. Transformation begins. The crude material of wounded identity is burned away, and something golden emerges. Individuation is the philosopher's stone, and silence is its crucible. The other two is placed in alchemy. They are left with their own shadow, sealed in the vessel of solitude. Some will resist, trying to escape the heat by seeking another empath to consume. But those who remain, those who endure the fire, will also transform. They will discover that the absence of the empath has forced them to awaken their own capacity for feeling. They may, for the first time, das de genuine remorse, genuine awareness. And from that awareness, they may also individuate. Thus, the empath's quiet exit is brutal revenge, not because it destroys, but because it transforms through destruction. It is the archetypal death before rebirth, and death, though terrifying, is always the threshold to new life. I tell you, the deepest revenge is not to wound another, it is to force them to meet themselves. Words cannot do this. Accusations cannot do this. Only silence can. Silence strips away excuses. stories, masks. It leaves the other naked before their own soul. That is the brutality. That is the gift. And so, in the grand design of the psyche, the empath's quiet exit is both an ending and a beginning. It ends the cycle of exploitation. It begins the cycle of individuation. It devastates and it liberates. It is the most brutal revenge because it is not chosen, it is fated, and it is the most sacred act because it is not human, it is archetypal. Remember this. The psyche does not care for comfort, it cares for wholeness. If comfort must be destroyed for wholeness to emerge, it will be destroyed. The empath's silence is one of the instruments of this destruction. And though the ego calls it cruelty, the soul calls it justice. Therefore, do not fear the silence. If you are the one who left, know that your silence is the doorway to your own soul. If you are the one left behind, know that the silence is the mirror of your shadow. Both are invitations, both are brutal, both are necessary. In the end, there is no revenge, only revelation. The empath's quiet exit reveals what was hidden, the true balance of love, the true cost of neglect, the true shape of the soul, and revelation, once seen, cannot be unseen. This is why silence is the sharpest sword. It cuts not the body, not the ego, but the illusion. And when illusion falls, truth stands bare. And so I leave you with this. Listen to the silence. Do not rush to fill it with noise, with replacement, with excuses. Let it speak, for in silence, the unconscious reveals itself, and in that revelation, the possibility of wholeness is born